part 2 of my rambling about tea. At one point the taxes were as high as 119%. Sheep's manure. Yum! Hello fellow Janeites, and welcome to part 2 of my rambling about tea. Whereas in part 1 I looked at the parts of Regency era tea culture that specifically related to Austen novels and used them to analyze that a bit. Here I'm going to be going over some of the cool facts that I learned about tea that maybe don't directly apply to Austen's novels, but do make up the tea drinking culture that she lived in. I will be going over the economics of tea, counterfeit tea, smuggling tea, some of the views of people at the time over who should be allowed to drink tea, tea storage, and since there are so many things I'm going over, it'll all be really brief, but hopefully informative. Tea was expensive in Regency era, with prices ranging from 3 to 10 shillings a pound. Most of that variation in price comes down to quality and type of tea. They divided quality into 9 different grades for both green and black tea, which is what they primarily drank. The variation in quality and price is sort of like today, how if you go to the grocery store to buy a box of tea bags versus if you go to a specialty tea shop and get some loose leaf, you'll pay a differing price for different quality of product. Neither one is necessarily superior to the other, it just depends on budget and what you prefer. A substantial portion of that price was going into taxes. Because tea was so popular and so selling it was so lucrative, the government wanted in on that. So there were very steep importing taxes on tea. Additionally, there were also licensing fees for you to be able to even sell tea at your establishment. These high taxes and licensing fees ultimately led to a high amount of counterfeit and smuggling within the tea industry of Regency era. How does one even counterfeit tea? Well, it depends on what type of tea. Green teas at the time were considered to be best if they had a bluish cast to them. This led to shipments of green tea often coming in dyed with Prussian blue or gypsum, which is a mineral. This led to the general impression at the time that green teas were easier to tamper with. But black teas were by no means immune, as sometimes shopkeepers would mix in this concoction called smooch. It was made by taking ash tree leaves, baking them, drying them, and then to give them that same sort of color diffusion in water, steeping them in copperas and sheep's manure. Yum! There was also a lot of smuggling going on at the time to evade the high taxes and licensing fees. In fact, at one point the taxes were as high as 119%, before being brought down to the very low 12.5%. So a lot of smuggling was going on. In fact, a member of a prominent tea-selling family, who the Austens actually sent to their London shop for tea while they were living at Steventon, quipped that the East India Tea Company, which I'm fairly certain had a government-sanctioned monopoly at the time, held only half of the market and smuggling the other half. That is a lot of smuggling, even if that is a bit of an exaggeration on his part. all of this begs the question, why was tea so lucrative? And the short answer is, everybody drank it. The upper classes, it was just a staple at the breakfast table, after dinner, when entertaining. But it wasn't only the upper classes drinking it. It was also consumed by the lower classes, who could buy the cheaper blends of tea, or in the upper class households, the tea leaves once consumed by the family would often be passed on to the servants for a second steeping, and could even then be sold on for a third steeping. Because the tea leaves that the lower levels of society used were often pre-steeped, cheaper, more diluted, or some combination thereof, the tea that they consumed was noticeably different from what you would find in a gentleman's parlor. But it was still tea, and they were still willing to spend a large chunk of their income in order to have what became considered a necessity. There were two main concerns that people had with the lower classes' consumption of tea. These are the concerns of the people in Regency era. The first was that their tea was unwholesome, which, if it had stuff like smooch in it, well, there's something to be said for that. However, on the flip side, with all of the parasites and waterborne diseases in the water at the time, boiling it before drinking it probably wasn't the worst move for your health. The other concern that people had was with the percentage of people's incomes that they spent on tea and accompanying sugar, with some instances of laborers spending 12% on it. However, as tea became a necessity rather than a luxury, it remained a staple with all walks of life in Regency England. Because tea was so valuable, it was typically, once purchased, kept in a locked chest or cabinet called a tea caddy. The tea that England imported was almost exclusively loose leaf, which means that no matter what certain American historical site gift shops insinuate, it was most likely loose leaf tea at the Boston Tea Party, and certainly loose leaf tea in gentlemen's drawing rooms. Those are all of the fun tea facts I have for you today. If you haven't yet, go check out part 1, where I go over some of the more social aspects of tea in Regency England and how that can apply to Jane Austen's novels. If you're still watching at this point, let me know what your favorite type of tea is. Personally, I like mint blends. A list of my sources is in the description down below, and until next time, run mad as often as you choose, but do not faint.